Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Tonight we're going to be talking about one of the grand masters of science fiction, the one and only Lois McMaster Bujold. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and we are joined by a couple of regulars here as well. So, Susan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, I am Susan Griffith. I am one half of the writing team of Clay and Susan Griffith. We've written the Vampire Empire series, the Crown and Key series, and now Clay is writing off on his own with some screenwriting for fantasy, and I am writing some more historical romance stuff. So very exciting, and I'm happy to be here today.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy, sometimes with and sometimes without strong romantic elements. I also write several different kinds of romance, and with Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station science fiction series.
So, I know I got introduced to Bujold with Shards of Honor. That was the first one I saw, the first one I picked up. And that particular book, and the reason I was curious about it was a friend of mine told me about it, and it was discussing having a protagonist with congenital health issues and yet all of the things in a future world, and looking at how he approached the long list of various adventures and going through and a lot of the issues that kind of dove into and dealt with. So, Susan, what was kind of your introduction into her worlds?
Mine was the Sharing Knife series. I stumbled across that one as a recommendation from a friend who knew I wasn't. It's not that I wasn't big on romance. I was not a straight romance. I wanted fantasy romance, and that was, she goes, this is something that's going to be right up your alley. And that's exactly what it was. It was a lot slower, in my opinion, than a lot of other books, but I kind of found that really easy reading. It was much more like, I want to almost call it like a cozy when it's not, because it's got some action adventure, but it's a slow burn and it's a slow story. And that fantasy period that's kind of like a Native American really intrigued me, and their whole bone knife and the sharing of souls and spirits really was an incredible introduction into spiritual fantasy in some ways.
Nancy, how about for you?
Well, there used to be this thing called the Science Fiction Book Club back in the days before ebooks. And they had a very clever and I think pretty common marketing tactic among book clubs of the era, in that every month they would send you a slip of paper that said what the selections for the upcoming month were. And if you didn't want them to be mailed to you, you had to check that off and send it back. And if you didn't do that, they would send the books and you were expected to pay for them. And I was not good about sending back the little slip. So that's how I discovered not only Bujold, but S.M. Sterling, is I got books from the Science Fiction Book Club that I didn't expect. And one of them was the Warrior's Apprentice, and I think The Vor Game. It was one of the other Miles Vorkosigan books. And so I was sort of leafing through, I was kind of curious. And in the first book, Warrior's Apprentice, we meet Miles as he's going over the obstacle course at the Imperial Military Academy. And his father and his grandfather are great military heroes of the planet Barier. So he's got to live up to a family tradition. And we'll talk a little bit more about Miles's physical challenges, I think, probably as we go on. But he does have serious physical challenges. And unfortunately, when he goes over the climbing wall at the military academy, he lands and breaks both legs and he washes out. And that's kind of, to me, a prime example of do the worst possible thing to your protagonist. And so I was intrigued by it, and I read the rest of it, and then I read whichever book it was that also came in the combined edition, and then I went out hunting for the others, and I was just totally sucked in by these characters and this world.
Once you read one, you just dive in. You just can't stop.
Yeah.
It's like a bag of Doritos. You can't have it.
It's true.
Well, and one of the things, because I grew up reading, a lot of the old masters, right? The Heinleins of the world and whatnot. So, I found it really interesting how similar so many of the themes are when you look at, when you look at the, and I'm going to screw this up all night long. It's been that kind of day. But when you look at the Vorkosigan saga, you see a lot of the same kind of themes, right? Space travel, these large empires. You get to see various houses and power and diplomacy. but at the same time, it was a very different take on, houses of power and how power moved, and even thinking about, military sci-fi, the way that she brings and presents conflict and strategy, and these are the things that grabbed me, was looking at a very different way of viewing how those things are structured. So, Nancy, what is it specifically? Let's dive a little bit deeper. What grabbed you and pulled you in more deeply and held you on the series?
Well, initially it was Miles, and then I tracked down Shards of Honor, which I think is the first one. And that was Cordelia, Miles's mother, and Errol, Miles's father, being marooned on this, I think it was a planet, together, and having to figure out a way to get off. And their cultures were at war at that time. And she came from a very humanist, artistically oriented culture, and the Vor of Barier, where Errol was from, they're all about military and feudal aristocracy and social hierarchy. And so I was really interested in that because they had kind of a clash of values, and yet they found a way to work together. So I was really interested in them. And then, of course, with the Warrior's Apprentice, we shift from them to Miles, and the rest of the series really focuses on Miles. But I was caught by the way he couldn't fulfill his dream of following his father and his grandfather. And so he found a way to use his great intellectual talents. He's very, very smart, very strategic thinker. And physically, his body is not useless, but it has a lot of limitations. And the way he found a path to a more active life, influencing the outcome of events on a wider scale. And I was just intrigued by it. I mean, sometimes I really, really like Miles, and I'm like, yeah, you go. And other times I just want to smack him. But he keeps me interested. So I guess it's Miles more than anything else that kept me in the series.
I would say that's the same for me. It's Miles's ability to rise above whatever is occurring, and by both hook or by crook. And that was a unique thing for me in terms of a character, where there's that little bit of, not darkness, but where anything goes in order to succeed. And it's usually not cruelty in any way, if that's, that's not the perception, but it's kind of outwitting and outsmarting the path and the challenges set before him in by a variety of different people. But to see how he goes about circumventing all of that, or charging right through without letting them realize what's happening. And that to me was one of the more intriguing aspects, because again, I'm the same thing with Nancy, is that, you get a character who's straight out of the bat, subpar compared to all the other people who are in his unit, and you see them rising. I'm almost getting like a Captain America vibe, like before he makes that change, what happens if he had stayed in that body, in Captain America, and how he had to maneuver and how he had to get through. And to me, that's utterly fascinating. It's a whole new hero that I wasn't expecting to really like. I was like, and I wanted to see how she did it. And I was stunned, like, all right, yeah, I like Miles, damn it. I'm intrigued by everything that he does. So it's the same thing, character.
So, and Nancy, anything you wanted to add? Or
No, just that when Susan's talked about Miles charging through, it reminded me of his slogan for the mercenary company he founded, the Dendari Free Mercenaries, the Dendari Mountains being a range on his father's lands. Their slogan is forward momentum. And there are times when that really kind of got Miles into some trouble.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I like about him. It's like, he's not always doing the right thing at the right time. Yeah. Sometimes he extracts himself by by a whisker, and that to me is exciting. It's to watch how he's going to get out of the situation, because Lord knows I can't figure out how to get him out of that situation, and yet she always got him out.
Yeah, and she did it in a way that was believable and made sense.
Correct. And unique. I mean, to the point where, not everybody was using those same techniques at that time.
Yeah.
Well, looking at one of the things that was most memorable for me out of it, and I was trying to look and see which book it was because I don't remember. It's the one where he has an incident on a mission, and basically gets kicked out of the service. Right? It's that moment where going through and it becomes kind of that big turning point, and seeing that, but you see that very human moment of trying to hide it, trying to cover it up, trying to work through all of that after all the health issues, after getting to the points he has, and then still getting kicked out of the service, right? But it's that I'm trying to cover it all up in those moments. So, I don't know who wants to take this one first. Is there a particular scene for you that really kind of defines him?
Well, one of my favorite of Miles's stories is the novella The Mountains of Mourning. And in the book, Miles has just graduated from the Imperial Military Academy after his years as a mercenary. And he's very excited about, finding his place in the military at last. And he's coming up from the lake to the gate, and this woman who, by her clothing and her speech and her mannerisms, is clearly from the backcountry, is demanding to see his father because she's owed justice. She has a right to petition the count for justice. And the guard is kind of a city fellow, and he's not sure what to make of this woman. And Miles ends up taking her up to see his father. The background of that moment of Miles being with his physical challenges, which becomes central to the story. And I'm trying not to spoil it, although I don't know if we really need to worry about spoilers. But you can tell that this woman does not know what to make of Miles. But she's desperate for justice for her murdered child. And the way the characters are described and the way the three of them interact just really is something that stands out in that story for me. So that would be one of the moments for me that's really just huge.
Susan?
I don't know if I can remember. It's been so long since I've read that. I would think now that Nancy talked about, I think one of the more horrific moments for me was when Miles broke both his legs. I mean, that came as such a shock. That was something that I wasn't expecting. Because you were thinking, he's going to make it through. You think that everything's, he's a hero. He's the main character. There's not, nothing's he's got to make it through. If he doesn't, what happens? And sure enough, she breaks both his legs. You're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? So those, I remember just being completely and utterly surprised at how quickly what I thought my expectations were, and then have them flipped upside down, and yet still carried along by the story to find out how he was going to get through all of this. So I do remember the minute Nancy talked about it, I was like, I just had that visceral feeling all over again, like, oh my gosh, this poor guy, he's going through so much, and now he's going to struggle 10 times harder. And I really felt for that. And that's probably one of the first moments where you really kind of fall for him a lot, just because, like, what have they set up against him? He's got everything that he has to struggle over, and I've never felt for a character more at that moment.
So, looking at and considering the overall saga, right? And especially when you can consider how, if you look at other series of the time, or that came before it, you look at the Dune, you look at you look at the Dune saga, you look at some of the work of Heinlein, you look at some of the other works of the period of time that are in that military sci-fi sort of period where you have these great epic, space operas going on. How do you kind of compare the worlds she's building here maybe against some of those others? Susan?
trying to think of. I mean, I didn't read a ton of really hardcore science fiction back in my day, other than the standards, and even the a lot of it was world building for me. She was building worlds that I had not really experienced at that time, especially with the Force Again series. I didn't read a lot of that that hardcore political aspect, so to get an introduction to that was really amazing for me to kind of, because I'm not a Game of Thrones person. I don't like a lot of politics and backstabbing, but his or her ability to make Miles's story compelling in a way that it's more, and I don't want to say he's pathological, but he really has a huge determination to get to what he wants to do. And of course, that comes from his disability, from all the challenges that he's had to put against. But to see him dance within the politics, dance within the military, do all the things that, I've never had to do, that was really unique for me. And like, again, I think coming from a character who's not a heroic, person that you expect to win and dance and be really smart ass like a James Bond kind of guy. That's not Miles. Miles has got this dark side to him that's, he's very intelligent, super intelligent, almost uncannily intelligent, but he's also got like this deeply ingrained prejudice against mutants, and you have to see him struggle through all of that. And I kind of liked seeing that. That's not something you usually got to see in terms of a lot of those kind of themes and stories. So,
well, and listening to Susan, I'm thinking one of the differences between, say, Heinlein and Clark and Bujold is that there is more social, and I'm not sure what exactly the word is. There's more interplay with social mores in the Vorkosigan books, I think.
I agree.
And do you all think? I think maybe this would make more sense if we actually explained Miles's situation. Does there anybody? Sure. Okay. Well, when Miles Okay, well, spoiler alert, put your fingers in your ears until I stop talking if you don't want this spoiled. But when Miles's mother was pregnant with him, his father was serving as the regent of the planet, and she was caught in a terrorist gas attack, and the gas that was used mutated. It didn't really mutate. It didn't affect his genetic structure, but it caused handicaps, birth defects in the unborn baby. And so their decision to go ahead and carry the pregnancy to term was extremely controversial, in part because Barier is a generation away from a nuclear war, and the radiation had caused genetic or physical abnormalities in people. And so in the backcountry, it was traditional that you just killed those babies because resources were so scarce, and to give them to someone who was never going to contribute, they just killed them. And so one reason Miles's parents never had another child was so that there would be no talk of supplanting Miles as his father's successor, which would have been a very realistic possibility. And I think the fact that she set Miles up the way she did caused more consideration of social issues and whose place is what in society, and a kind of a questioning of the aristocratic hierarchy on Barier, because for me, I think all that radiates out from Miles and from his parents because of Miles. But I don't know if you all would see it the same way.
I kind of do in that regard, that I think, the way the society was, that most people wouldn't have given him the backing. First of all, I don't think he would have made it to term. I mean, and I think one of the things, it wasn't really the poison, it was a side effect to the poison. That's what got Cordelia. And so they actually had to take him out of her, if I remember, and then transferred to some sort of machine. And I can't remember. and all of that was when he was severely affected by all of that. But the thought that he would have never made it. First of all, and if he had it,
if it had belonged to anybody else.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, but because they were devoted to him and made sure that he had everything that he needed to succeed, because he was highly intelligent. He had the mind. He just didn't have the body to go through with what a normal person would have been able to do. So I think you're very spot on in that regard. That's a huge element to it.
Well, and as you all know, and people watching this panel may not, Miles is extremely short. His spine is twisted, and he's probably, if you're 5 feet tall, you're taller than Miles. His head is oversized, and his bones are very brittle, hence the broken legs when he came off the obstacle course. And so that's something that Miles has to deal with everybody he interacts with at some point. Because you look at him and he doesn't look like anybody else from Briar. So he's not what you expect.
Well, so this is one of the reasons I actually went and originally picked up the book, was because I wanted to see how this was dealt with. We're very accustomed to feudal situations where it's, you've got at least an heir and a spare, right? And when you're in a situation where and I was thinking in terms of lineage, and especially if you're having something like this with this many genetic issues, the justification of, nope, we're going to make sure it's this one person. And what does that mean for an empire going forward? That's one of the things that I was always fascinated by, that idea of how did Miles' arc go? Because again, you've got somebody who was in essence in that lineage, and you give it's that side of, I'm taking a character, I'm putting them in the absolute worst possible situation, in the absolute worst way in this world, to see what arc they go on. And I think this is where so much of the story held the power, was how much can you run somebody through, let them have that arc, let them have that growth, but then balance that against, especially when you describe the world that they're in and the games that have to be played to get him to that point. And that was one of those things I always found interesting, but also as a writer and some of the other, cultural studies and all the other things, going, what's the likelihood here? And because there are some times I will absolutely say that there's aspects of the story that, as the culture, the way it's written, if your leaders are bucking the norms that hard, you're presenting strength for this generation, but weakness going forward.
Well, and if you all remember the book Mirror Dance, some people got hold of some of Miles's DNA because his genetic structure is not mutated. It's his body that's affected.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they grew a clone of Miles with the idea of supplanting Miles with this clone. And the dynamic between the clone, whose name is Mark, and Miles is really interesting. And it's in that book that they discuss in more detail Errol and Cordelia's decision not to have another child. And it's, if I remember correctly, Mark actually envies Miles, because Miles is legitimately born to his parents, created by them because they wanted a child, and he's kind of a devious plot gone wrong that they've ended up with. And once again, it's the way the characters interact and the way she explores the characters' internal conflicts and motivations that, for me, makes that book really interesting.
They talk a lot about the mutations and that there's such a fear. And this goes back to the very first book, I think it was Falling Free, where, people were, I think they were called the Quaddies. I think Nancy reminded me that they were called Quaddies. And they had 4 arms, but they were bred to be able to exist out in space and do the work that is required of them. But there became such a ingrained fear in the later books that, people women were afraid to carry their babies to term because, there was a chance they were basically putting them in replicators or something, uterine replicators, I think they were called, to try and make sure that they remained mutagen free. And I liked all of that. That was a whole new social aspect to the books that I, again, wasn't expecting. And Miles, again, is at the forefront of it because, there's some people thought he wasn't, had mutations, and he didn't. It was because of the side effects of the attack that actually changed him, but it was more on a cellular level, not on a mutation level. And it was really interesting that, all these social challenges that are proposed by medical technology and again, cloning, all of this stuff. And to me, that was really fascinating to see as a commentary about the world that we're dealing in the most subtle. And again, that's the beauty of science fiction, is that you can talk about real concepts that we deal with every day and put them in these far-fetched, novels, and yet you're still talking about it, and you're still being forced to think about what that means for a society to have to face that kind of things. And what are the quaddies really people? They're doing the work. They're and we're talking, in dangerous work. It's not like it's are they expendable? How do they feel about it? How does the world themselves feel about it? So I love that kind of talking about our societal problems in a much more unique way.
Well, and if I remember right, that came out about the time some of the cloning stuff was going on with Dolly, and
I don't know. Could be.
Somewhere I want to say it was all about that time, and we saw that, and we saw we were seeing some of those notions of cloning and that flowing through, and I think that's an interesting timing as well, using some of that as inspiration, if I'm remembering that correctly in the timing of it. But, so, to kind of put a bow on in terms of the saga, looking at the familial arc, right? When you go from parents all the way going through multiple generations and that generational legacy, again, it's that idea of, as writers, the story ends wherever we stop. It's not that the story ends, it's the story ends wherever we stop. And when you get to see an arc running that long, you get to watch a lot more about how characters develop over time and the repercussions of actions and lifetimes as that builds up. For you, what does that generational notion look like to you in terms of story and how she spun the story? I don't know who wants that one.
I'll start. Excuse me. In the early books, you have Errol's father, General Piotr Vorkosgan, who was a hero of the Sitagandan War, partly through cavalry, like as in horses cavalry, not tanks cavalry, resistance in the mountains of Barayar to the Sitagandan invaders in the war. And his attitudes are very fixed and very definite. And they do not include having children who have been adversely affected by gas inherit his title. Then you have Miles's parents, who are more flexible, and she comes from a much more humanistic culture. He comes from the more traditional background, and so you see them kind of negotiating how they personally are going to deal with the competing values they have. And then you have Miles, who's the product of both of them. And in the next to last book of the series, there's a passing of the torch from that. But there's a point earlier in the novella The Mountains of Mourning, where Miles is talking about his grandfather, and he says, he adapted and changed. He adapted to horse cavalry. He adapted when that went away. He adapted when Barayar moved in the direction he'd been reluctantly pointing and urging, and then it passed him, and he adapted again. And then he got hit with me, and he couldn't adapt anymore. And how they had not left Miles alone with his grandfather until he was 5 years old. But there was always a bodyguard with Miles when he was with his grandfather. because of that. And it was an interesting look at the way societal attitudes change, not just within a society, but within families, and the way that affects the family dynamic sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I was never one for that kind of sweeping generational thing, but the characters themselves, the sense of family, the sense of, I'm not, like I said, I'm not a big Game of Thrones fan. I'm sure that's people are gasping, but
I'm not either, for what it's worth.
that kind of malevolence and deviousness that goes with politics, that goes with the this kind of hierarchy, was never anything that really intrigued me. But I will say that this particular family was really unique in the sense of I didn't feel that. I didn't feel like I was watching a bloodbath. I felt like I was watching manipulative chess where everything is being moved and counter-moved. And that was more intriguing to me without all the, burning people in minotaurs or bulls. Or, it wasn't as graphic and horrific. But you still got that sense that there is malevolence within the family, but because the core was strong, his parents and the people that they chose around them were very solid in terms of giving Miles every possibility without giving it to him. He still made it on his own, but they made sure that he had the chance to do all that. And that center core was where I really focused and really liked their stories and liked that concept of giving him what he needed at that time to advance and become who he should have been. He always can be. Most people don't get that chance, and they were solid about that. Protecting him from his grandfather, all of that. They knew what they had to do, and I liked that.
So, not necessarily moving out of the saga, but I mean, also looking at some of her other work, right? We move into more of the fantasy side of things. And Susan, you were talking a little bit about more of the romantic side. And Nancy, I know you aren't as deep in those, but across some of the other work, is there a favorite? Susan, I'll go to you. Huh?
The sharing knife. I'm such a huge fan of the sharing knife. It really came out of the blue for me, where I wasn't really hoping for a lot out of the book, and I got everything I wanted. There were moments where my brain kind of like, I don't understand why they're doing it. And one big was the age difference between the two main characters. So there was a lot of things to overcome, but I wound up being charmed by the characters, their world, this very slow pace that I needed at that time without having to, and I think I was mentioning it's almost like a cozy before the cozies. It was that warmth that I needed, that sense of love and affection, and the willingness to make a change in a society that did not want to change. And it's like, how are they going to do this? They're not, they come from two different worlds. It tells a story of a lake walker and what they call, I think they were farmers. And the lake walkers were mystical and magical and were, feared by everyone. And because they used the bones of their ancestors to kill these creatures. And then you have to give your own soul or find a soul that's willing to give their own soul to, again, imbue the knife. And people were terrified of it and thought it was, death magic and all these other horrible things. And yet when you hear Dag, who's the lake walker you're talking, he's an older lake walker and he's handicapped. Again, I think there's a theme to it. He has he's lost one of his arms, and you really get this sense of, peace with him. He's come to his realization. This is who I am. He's not young trying to come out and find anything. And he finds this young girl and he saves her from one of the malices, these creatures. And it was an incredible story, and to watch their relationship and their struggle to try and bring their families together and eventually their whole cultures together was a long journey, which I really loved, and how they did it and how they got that bridge was an amazing read.
Nancy, how about for you?
Well, I have not read the Sharing Knife series or the Chalian series, so I can't really speak to those. I have been tremendously enjoying the Penric and Desdemona novella series that she's doing every several months. And Penric has his life upended in the first novella when Desdemona, who is a multiple hundreds of years old demon, jumps from her present host to him. And I won't give away how that happens, but the adjustment was significant for Penric, who was a learned scholar of one of the gods in this world. The bastard, I think, is the god that Penric serves. And it's different from the Vorkosigan saga, and it sounds like it's different from the Sharing Knife in that Penric's life is really, by the third or fourth book, it kind of settles down into a pretty nice pattern, and most of the trauma and the upheaval in the stories happen to other people, which is very different from the Vorkosigan books. But, sometimes you want that change of pace. Like Susan was saying, sometimes you just want something that's a little calmer and a little steadier maybe than, and not all this upheaval. And so despite wishing that Bujold would once again return to Miles Vorkosigan and give him something to do, I'm really enjoying the Penric books a lot. And after hearing Susan talk about the Sharing Knife, I'm sort of thinking, I tried that and I didn't get into it, but maybe that wasn't the right time for me to read that book. Maybe I should go look at it again.
I hope you do. I think you'd like if you give it a longer breath. That's the thing. And again, we're in such a world where fast-paced action is the thing. And don't get me wrong, I love some fast-paced action, but there's times when I really need it. And I know that book came at a very important time. That's when my mom was sick, and I didn't want the action. I wanted this slower pace. I wanted to let a book breathe and learn and spend time with the characters without having to rush from action to action, from moment to life-threatening moment. I just wanted to see how they lived. How did this culture survive? And the same thing with the Penric books. I really enjoyed those as well because it was a different pace and the characters were unique. The whole thought where the demon originally was like in a fox or a lion, and how all these concepts that these layers of, and not demonness, but I guess it is, that these different ways these demons have garnered over 200 years. And then suddenly they get to sit there and chit-chat with this learned scholar who found him quite by accident. I loved all of that. And you get to learn how he adjusts and how the demons adjust, how Desdemona adjusts. And I love the fact that there's so many different voices within Desdemona, because she's also had a lot of other lives and a lot of other things. So there's a healer in her. There's a chaos in her. There's all this other stuff, and you get you're having a multiple personality come to life before your eyes, but they're all interesting. They're all fascinating individuals, and how all of that kind of makes up a life was a unique twist to me on how that happened. And I loved all the stories. There's some action in Penric. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of actions. There's pirates. There's all kinds of weird stuff going on. There's plagues. There's so much going on. So it's really fascinating to see unique perspectives on how they're going to deal with this, and how they're doing healing, how they're doing fighting, how they're doing chaos, how they release the chaos. You can't keep it in you. Once you're casting these kind of things, you've got to let the chaos out, and it's really kind of fascinating to watch how that works.
Well, and all that kind of goes to, I think, part of the reason that I find her so fascinating as a writer. We've all heard the whole thing of, well, find your niche, find your genre, and stick to it. I don't think any of us here have actually done that, but the fact that to find that level of success in very, very differing styles, very different series, very different stories, but at the same time you find some of the same real kind of feeling themes. We see, you can see some of the through lines where she as a writer is kind of on her own journey. What's she doing? What's she exploring? How's she going through and developing these worlds, doing very stylistic world building and storytelling and creating these characters. And that's one of the things that I really find fascinating is being able to create that across multiple genres so well, so successfully. So I don't know what thoughts do you guys have about just her career wise and being able to move through very differing genres and very different styles of storytelling.
It's easy now. I mean, I think a lot of us, I mean, not super easy, but it's more accepted now for writers to bounce between genres. Nobody's held as strictly as they used to be. And I think she was one of the major successes of being able to bounce between the different genres. And I found that utterly amazing. I mean, I think she started out with fan fiction, then she did a little bit of science fiction, and then she made it with the Force again in a world dominated, men dominated genre for a good portion of the period, and become beloved by both men and women, which was huge. And then to be able to bounce back into fantasy, then back into, just so many different areas from romance to everything. And that she still had that ability to tell these remarkable, unique stories and unique views, using, handicaps, using, prejudice, all these major things, these major themes that resonate within our society, and be able to tell them in multiple ways. And people found them just as relevant and just as interesting to want to read is a testament to how skilled she is in keeping that on her docket, like in every genre she could touch.
Yeah, and it's, as Susan was saying, you can do that now. But when the only option was traditional publishing, I once heard a New York Times bestselling author, who I don't have permission to quote, so I'm not going to drop her name, say that if you are, and this was years ago, before e-publishing and independent publishing was a thing, she said, if you establish yourself in New York as Raisin Brand, they don't want you to go be cornflakes. They don't like that. And I think one thing that may have worked in Bujold's favor is that she was very well established as an author with the Vorkosigans before she branched out into fantasy. And I think there was a readership who liked the way she dealt with characters enough to follow her and at least try it out, and then liked it. Just my guess.
I think that's true, because I think women tend to want to read the fantasy, and she's very character driven. I don't think a lot of people, recognize that it's not really the world as much as it is the characters. You come for the world, but you stay for the character, and the characters are what drives you through. And I think that ability to be able to take those characters, and because she had the chops to be able to branch out, but people came for the characters, and that's why they went with her wherever she went.
Right. And also, both Miles and Penrick, and it sounds to me like the people in the sharing night, had a base level of compassion and kindness. I mean, some of the things that get Miles into trouble is he's trying to help somebody. And Penrick marches into situations where he makes it very plain to the reader that he does not want to do this. But either he's compelled to do it by the temple and the god, or his sense of fairness propels him into it. And that's, I think, a commonality that runs through all the things that I've read of hers.
Same.
And yeah.
Well, and Susan, you brought something up I did want to touch on. So I did an article a number of years ago now talking about how authors react to fan fiction and some of the legal consequences and IP and all these kinds of things. And I think one of the other things is that Bujold was really fascinating about is for how long of a period of time, and she still is very, very much embraces fan fiction. right? And even though she now comes out and says, look, I don't read any of it, I don't touch any of it, but go explore my worlds, great. Versus a lot of writers are like, nope, stay out of my toys. And I mean, a lot of that's contract reasons and legal reasons and IP reasons and all the stuff you get into. But I thought that I brought her up in an article, and this is, like I said, has been a number of years ago, about her take on fan fiction, because I think, again, it is that creative aspect of when you build worlds, if you're touching people and impacting people and people want to go play in those worlds, exploration of that and other characters, other aspects of those worlds has some value, even if it then creates some problems for us as the owners of the IP, the creators of the IP, and whatnot. Nancy, I'm gonna throw this to you, being a reformed attorney. But I mean, any thoughts about that with kind of that take on fanfic? And do you think that because again, I think she did get a lot of that start with fanfic herself, kind of back in the day, writing her own. But does that hold anything for you?
Well, I will say, first of all, that I'm no longer an attorney because my license has been in mothballs for 20 years. So nobody should take anything I say as legal advice of any sort. But I actually got my start writing Legion of Superheroes fan fiction in Amateur Press Alliance, which, for simplicity's sake, we'll just call a fan club for comic book grown-ups. It's like a chain letter for adults. And Paul Levitz, who was at that time either the editor-in-chief or the publisher of DC, was a member of the group.
Oh, wow.
And he basically said, like Bujold, everybody in this group knows who these characters belong to. Do what you want to do, but just know that for legal reasons, I can't read any of it. And so if anybody's going to throw stones at fan fiction, it can't be me, because that would be just really hypocritical. And I think if people can encourage that, it's great when they do. Like George Lucas always said, go play in my universe. I don't know if Disney's quite that forbearing, but he used to be, from what I remember hearing about it. And I think that builds on your fandom, because people love you more because they let you play in their... Okay, I'm backing that up. They love you more because you let them play in your sandbox. Sorry. So, I think it's an individual thing, but there used to be a saying in copyright law that if you don't enforce it, it's waived. Mm-hmm. So that may be the reason some of these people, and Jim, I know that you've done presentations on this kind of thing. So there's always that, and trademark, I think, may be the same way, but I'm happy to say I never delved deeply into either of those arcane areas of law.
Yes, the dark arts. I'll make my comment in a moment. So Susan, how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I started in fan fiction. I'm no different than just about any other writer, whether they want to admit it or not. Whether you're writing it, on your own little journals, or you're putting it online, or you're publishing a fanzine. I mean, we're all thinking of stories or playing with characters that were created in other worlds, and it's a great testing ground. It's a great way to begin. I don't ever expect to make money, and never, for all the Star Trek and all the Star Wars and all the Lord of the Rings and all of the Lost World, all the stories that I have written and, are probably still flowing out there somewhere. I would never think of trying to make money off of them. They were just tests for me to see if I could create great characters and take stories in new directions. And I think that's fantastic. And yeah. I mean, if somebody was writing Greyfriar fiction or Crown and Key fiction, I wouldn't care. I'd be happy. I'd be thrilled. I wouldn't read them. But, again, because of rules, and I don't want to be tainted by them in any way, because I don't want people to think that I'm stealing from them. But I think it's one of the greatest flatteries a person can get, that people are so fascinated with their characters or their worlds that they feel compelled to carry them on in new ways, or just keep going with them. So yeah, I totally believe that there is a value to it, and I love the fact that Bujold had the same upbringing as some of us.
Well, and I mean, not to be an attorney on TV because I am not an attorney, but I deal with a lot of them. I've regularly do workshops and panels and stuff around IP, and I kind of the way there's a degree here of depending on who has licensed it that controls a lot of this, right? Because if you have sold your rights, you've licensed your rights, your publisher has a lot of that control. But if it's yours, you've done the indie publishing path. Well, that's much more up to you as to what you do with your property. But there are definitively risks to giving permission to people to write and play in your sandbox. One of the things I've said is if you're going to do that, write the rules and publish the rules about what people can do. Usually it's if you're going to let people play in your sandbox, don't let them play with your main characters. Because the big risk there is not necessarily that you're going to lose your characters, but if you happen to be working towards something and somebody has written something in the fan fiction, we all know there's only so many stories, and if you've really developed those characters, a lot of the time people will see where things are going and they want to see if they're right. Well, you get into trouble because all of a sudden somebody says, well, they stole my idea. We all know. Well, I don't say we all know. When I teach workshops, one of the things I frequently have done, and I think this is part of the reason I think this is useful, is that notion that I've stood in the front of a workshop and said, yeah, here's the book I'm working on, here's the characters, here's the plot, here's the arc. Doesn't really matter. I've done that because everybody in that room could go take and write that story, and it's not going to look anything like what I'm doing or what I've done. And fan fiction broaches that because if people are writing in your framework, they're going to butt up against that. You can't help it if you've built that arc, that world, you're naturally pushing in certain directions. So, but I embrace that because that is another way of growing your fandom. It is a way of celebrating your fans. And ultimately, I always look at readers and writers when they are reading a work. That's an act of co-creation. I was on a show last night and we were talking about some of this notion of co-creation, where the experience of me as a writer, the way I craft it, what I see, what I visualize in my head, and the stuff that never makes it to paper, that story will never be seen or read exactly the same way as it plays in my head, right? And as readers go through and they consume the work, they're going to be putting that up against everything they've ever seen, they've ever read, they've ever done, their experiences and everything else. So the way they experience it will never be exactly what's in my head. And I think that fan fiction gives people an opportunity to explore worlds and things that have impact and influence on them. I think that was a really long-winded way of saying something.
It made sense. But, I remember Marion Zimmer Bradley used to do those Darkover anthologies. And I was at one point in time a subscriber to her fantasy magazine. And she stopped doing them. She said because she had a story, and each issue, if I remember correctly, of the Darkover anthologies had guidelines for what was to be in that issue. But somebody had sent in a story that was not exactly like, but similar to the story she had under development for a book. And the publisher said, we can't publish the book. It's too similar. And this came and you read it. And that's what I heard. That's my vague recollection that's why she stopped doing. It wasn't Darkover anthologies. It was Sword and Sorceress. I don't know why I got confused with it. But anyway, she stopped doing the anthologies because this story came in that was too similar to the story that she was working on, and that was the end of that book.
Well, and that has been the case numerous times, where if you were both writing and editing, get you into trouble. And so that's, again, that really kind of becomes why when you do certain things, you have to understand. And I think this is also why we see a lot of the contracts written the way they are these days, which are if something has a similarity, those kinds of things happen. So I kind of want to, as we're getting towards wrapping up, I do want to throw a question out there. So, what kind of an influence has Bujold had on you guys and your writing and your careers? Do I have to flip a coin?
No, I mean, I can go first. I already started my career when I first discovered her. I discovered her late, in the 2000s. I was already writing. I was already published by then. But I still feel like I learned to take a breath from her. Our pacing in our books are like manic on a lot of it. And I really am trying to take longer pauses. I know the publishers were always like, no, we need more action here. Like, no, I kind of want a breath scene. I kind of always want to have that ability to spend time with the characters and get them to converse and get into more in-depth conversations and not be ashamed of it, not be worried that it's not going to be palatable to the author. I mean, to the reader. So to me, I love her world building. I don't think I'll ever have that kind of range, but her characters, the way she drafts those characters and how she lets them really come to life on their own with intriguing elements to them, from handicaps to prejudice to all those things. Those, or old age, or, whatever it was going to be, that you can still tell an incredibly good story. And your characters can be incredibly deep characters, even and possibly deeper because of them. And I think it's a great thing to want to embrace in your own writing. It's to find ways that those kind of disparaging handicaps or whatever, or social ambiguities, it can be given life to characters that, most, 50 years ago would have never seen the light of day. So I like that. I like the long breaths between the plunge. Those are the things I've taken away from her.
Nancy?
Not taken away from her, but, used as a guide.
You've borrowed. You've learned.
As it were. Yeah.
I've been inspired.
Yeah. Your characters can do things that do make readers sometimes want to smack them. And the reader will still follow along and root for the character if you do it well. And that is, I've not actually tried to do that because I don't think I'm at the point where I have the knack of doing that. But that the character does not always have to be right on the money. In fact, they're more interesting if they're not. And you can tell social commentary stories within the framework of space opera, because that's basically what the Vorkosigan books are, is space opera. And also, she's really good at building magic systems, and I just envy that.
So much.
Well, is there anything else you guys wanted to talk about this evening about the Grandmaster?
Read the series. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I think we're saying
I was just going to say, read the series in order, because the characters evolve as they go through each series, and it will be more meaningful for you if you read them in order.
I agree with that, because I was so desperate to read the Cordelia stuff and her parents, and my folks convinced me, don't do that. You've got to take the slower path. Again, take the longer path and you will be rewarded. So I agree with that 100%. I was much more rewarding, I think, than jumping straight in on those. I would just say, go get one of her books. Don't feel like don't give up on them. On ones that may not hit your palate. I think each book has its own merits and are really fascinating if you give them the chance to really find their footing. Even, the sharing knife, which not a lot of people like because it's slow, that those last couple of books are amazing because of the reward you get from sticking with it and getting it as a complete series. And I wish more people would discover it. So go out there and find a Bujold book. Read all.
Oh, we never did say that she's won multiple Hugo and Nebula awards for her various series. So it's not just us who think they're so good.
Correct. She is amazing for a reason.
Well, on that note, I guess we can put a bow on this one. Thanks for joining. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, what people need to add on to that holiday to be read pile. So, Susan.
You can find me on Blue Sky at Susan Z. Griffith. You can find me on probably still a little bit on Facebook sometimes. I'm trying to get on Instagram. It's hard. But you can have a website, clayandsusanGriffith.com, that you can find me just about anywhere. Send me an email, wherever you need. Working on the New York magical historical fantasy. It's completely edited now, so I just got to get it out there and get a cover for it, and it is going on its way. So probably not this Christmas, but definitely early, maybe mid next year, hopefully. So we'll get it up there. So,
Nancy?
You can find me at nancynorthcott.com. I'm some variation of Nancy Northcott on pretty much all social media. I've more or less migrated from X to Blue Sky, so you won't find me posting anything much on X. My most recent release is Spies for the Holidays, which is a compilation of 3 of the romantic suspense novellas that I wrote. If I hold it up in front of my face, maybe it will show, for the Canham Castle Holiday Romance series, and those books are no longer available. So these are the print versions of those 3. My next release will be The Speaker for All, which will be sometimes after the first of the year, and that is part of the Outcast Station series.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingprose.com, and of course here at Continual, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for joining.